New York City never sleeps, but on this particular evening, its heartbeat felt quicker, heavier, almost feverish. The streets shimmered under the pale glow of streetlights, awash with the blur of yellow cabs darting past, the chatter of strangers colliding in passing, and the distant wail of a subway train disappearing into the dark belly of the city. For Rachel Smith, the weight of her freshly minted nursing degree pressed down on her like an anchor. She stepped onto the 7:48 p.m. subway at Queensboro Plaza, bound for New York Presbyterian Hospital in Manhattan, her pulse in sync with the steel wheels grinding over the tracks. Her fingers tightened around her laminated ID badge, and though she told herself she was ready, her heart betrayed a cocktail of exhilaration and dread. This was her first night shift, 12 long hours in the emergency department, where life and death did their dangerous waltz without warning. Before we dive deeper into this story, take a second to support our channel. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more stories like this one to life. The subway rattled and swayed, its old fluorescent lights flickering overhead like a dying pulse. A child's laughter briefly echoed from the other end of the car before being swallowed by the mechanical roar. Commuters avoided eye contact, faces lit by the glow of their phones, each trapped in their own private orbit. As the train plunged into the tunnel stretch between Lexington Avenue, 59th Street, and 5th Avenue, 59th Street, a notorious dead zone for cell service, Rachel glanced at the grimy window, her own reflection fractured by flashes of passing lights. Then, buzz. Her phone vibrated against her palm. A message. She glanced down and froze. Request an MRI. 3 words. No sender. No previous conversation. Just that. Her brow furrowed. Probably a glitch, she told herself. The signal always dropped here. And yet, the unease clung to her like a second skin. When she emerged from the station and approached the looming red brick facade of New York Presbyterian, the building rose like an immovable fortress against the night sky. Inside, the emergency department was already a storm. Stretchers rolled in from ambulances, monitors beeped in frantic rhythms, and the sterile bite of antiseptic mixed with the raw tang of fear. Rachel was greeted by her fellow night shift crew. Marcus Reynolds, a veteran nurse with a booming voice and a heart bigger than his frame. Lila Chen, sharp-eyed and sharper-witted, who could start an IV blindfolded. And Dr. Emily Carter, the attending physician, calm, meticulous, and famously hard to impress. Rachel had barely begun to settle into her assigned station when the ER doors slammed open. A paramedic barreled in with a man sprawled on a stretcher, his chest rising only in shallow, desperate flickers. The next moments erupted into chaos, Dr. Carter barking orders, Marcus wheeling over crash equipment, Lila snapping on gloves with practiced precision. Rachel's training surged forward, her hands moving on instinct, her mind cataloguing the cascade of emergency steps. Then, it happened. A voice, not loud, but crystal clear, breathed in her ear. Do it now. Her head jerked slightly, but no one was close enough to whisper. The words anchored themselves in her chest. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. We need an MRI. Now. Heads turned. That kind of call usually came from a senior resident, not a rookie nurse on her first week. But something in her tone left no room for debate. Minutes later, the scan lit up the truth. A brain aneurysm on the verge of rupture. Surgery would be risky, but without it, the man wouldn't survive the hour. The team worked with surgical precision, buying him the time he desperately needed. By the time he was stable in the ICU, Rachel was back in a chair, her legs heavy, her hands trembling, not from fatigue, but from the realization that she'd acted on something beyond logic. How had she known? The man lived. His family's tearful gratitude washed over her like a tide she didn't know how to stand against. Dr. Carter approached, her face unreadable. She gave Rachel a slow nod. You did well, she said, her voice measured, almost wary. Then she added, softer, like you'd done this before. The way her eyes lingered on Rachel made her shiver, as if the doctor had seen a ghost. Several nights later, during the familiar dead stretch between Lexington Avenue, 59th Street, and 5th Avenue, 59th Street, Rachel's phone buzzed again. She pulled it from her pocket and the words glowed on the screen. Perform a tracheostomy. Her breath caught. That night, the ER exploded into action when EMTs rushed in a man in his 70s, his skin pale, lips turning a deep shade of blue. His airway was closing, seconds slipping away. Without hesitation, Rachel's voice cut through the noise. "He needs a tracheostomy, now." Dr. Carter paused only a fraction before nodding sharply and issuing the order. Minutes later, the airway was secured, and color returned to the man's face. Another life saved, another uncanny intervention she couldn't explain. After the adrenaline ebbed, Rachel joined Lila Chen in the staff lounge. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and lemon disinfectant, its walls lined with framed photographs, portraits of doctors who had once walked these halls but were now gone. Some photos were yellowed with age, others crisp and new. Rachel's gaze landed on one in particular, a young man, mid-30s, strikingly handsome, in a classic old-world way. His dark hair was neatly combed, his posture exuding confidence without arrogance. The brass nameplate beneath read, "Peter Van Saint, M.D." Something about the image made her linger. "Who's he?" she asked, nodding toward the frame. Lila followed her gaze and smiled faintly. "That's Dr. Van Saint. He was special, brilliant, one of the best cardiologists this hospital's ever had. Patients loved him, staff respected him, but..." She hesitated, lowering her voice. "There was a scandal years ago. A malpractice suit. They said he made a fatal mistake during surgery. Some think it wasn't his fault. A few even say he was set up. Whatever the truth, it ruined him. Not long after, he died here, in his office. They called it suicide." Rachel absorbed the words, eyes still fixed on the photograph. She didn't know why the image held her attention. Maybe it was the sharpness in his gaze, the quiet strength in his expression. It was a face you could trust, a face that didn't seem to belong among the dead. The conversation drifted to other topics, but when Rachel left the lounge, she found herself glancing back at the picture one more time. Weeks began to pass in uneven rhythms. Sometimes the messages arrived twice in 1 week. Other times her phone stayed silent for days, occasionally weeks, before that familiar buzz returned, slicing through the noise of her shift. Each one came at the exact moment it was needed: a collapsed lung, a silent internal bleed, a medication that had to be administered within seconds. Every instruction was precise. Every patient lived. Her colleagues noticed. After the chaos of each emergency faded, someone always asked, "How did you know?" Marcus would lean on the counter, his voice somewhere between amazement and suspicion. Lila, pen paused mid-chart, would study her for a beat too long. Even Dr. I. Carter's sharp, calculating eyes seemed to track her movements more closely than before. Rachel's answer never changed, just a shrug and a quiet intuition. She gave them nothing more. But whispers had started to bloom in the corners of the hospital. Conversations dropped into silence when she walked into the room. She caught fragments: her name, the word luck, and sometimes something darker. She didn't know what was worse, that they were watching her, or that she couldn't explain herself even if she wanted to. One sleepless night, after a shift that had pushed her to the edge of exhaustion, Rachel wandered into an unused conference room. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed faintly, their sterile glow pooling across the long, empty table. She sat there alone, nursing a paper cup of coffee gone cold, when her phone buzzed. This time there was no medical directive, just 3 words: strength in weakness. She stared at the message, the phrase settling into her like it belonged somewhere deep. It pulled her back to the quiet battles no one had seen, the nights she studied in a cramped apartment while working 2 jobs, the funeral where she stood alone after her father died, the way she'd spent her life blending into the background, never asking for more than she thought she deserved. But here now something was shifting. These moments, these impossible interventions, were stirring a part of her that wanted to matter, that wanted to be more. And yet, the questions pressed in like a tightening vice. Was she really the one making these calls, or just a vessel for something unseen? She didn't know. But the results spoke for themselves. Families hugged her in relief, lives were saved, and with each success, the pull of whatever force was guiding her became harder to resist. The cost of whatever force was guiding her had begun to show. The easy camaraderie she'd once felt with her colleagues was fading, replaced by an unspoken distance. Conversations that used to flow between shifts now faltered. The warmth in Marcus's booming voice had cooled, Lila's quick wit reserved for others. Even Dr. Carter's brief nods carried an edge of scrutiny. The whispers were no longer just faint murmurs in the background. They had grown into full-blown speculation, the kind that left its weight hanging in the air when she walked into a room. She could feel their judgment in the sideways glances, the slight pauses in conversation, the way laughter seemed to evaporate when she appeared. The pressure to fall in line, to play by the rules and abandon the strange, unexplained instinct she'd been following, pressed against her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. And yet, she knew there was no going back. She had crossed a line, stepped into a place most people never even knew existed, and the door had slammed shut behind her. One night, during the fevered chaos of a double shift, Rachel paused in the middle of the ER. The noise swirled around her, monitors beeping in jagged rhythms, the wheeled rattle of gurneys, the clipped commands of doctors moving at war speed, but her mind drifted elsewhere. She thought about the strange messages, about the moments that had pulled her from the ordinary into the impossible, about how each one had changed her. When the adrenaline finally ebbed and the ER settled into that eerie quiet that comes only in the early hours, Rachel stood in a shadowed corner near the nurses' station, her eyes following the reflection of the city's lights in the polished floor tiles. Manhattan's restless heartbeat throbbed through the windows, the pulse of a city that never truly slept, and she realized that her own pulse had begun to match it, steady but relentless, always waiting for the next call, the next message. She didn't know who was behind them, and lately she wasn't sure if she wanted to. The messages had once felt like lifelines. Now, they sometimes felt like chains. Each vibration of her phone was a reminder that there were unseen forces pulling her deeper into a world she couldn't fully understand. The hospital, once a sanctuary of order and healing, now felt like a maze of locked doors and shadowed corners, where every lingering look might be suspicion and every whisper could be about her. Standing there, the scent of antiseptic thick in the air and the faint echo of sirens bleeding in from the streets, Rachel understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever lay ahead, it would test her in ways she had never imagined. And she wasn't sure if she feared it, or if some part of her had already begun to crave it. Yet, amidst the chaos, a stubborn ember of resilience kept burning inside her. Rachel clung to the moments of clarity, those sharp, undeniable flashes when her actions had saved a life, as if they were proof that she wasn't lost in some delusion. Each success, whether dramatic or quiet, stood like a lighthouse in the storm, reminding her that even in the strangest, most uncertain moments there was purpose, there was meaning. The trials that tested her faith were not without reward. Every challenge forced her to push against her own limits, to find strength in places she didn't know existed. Slowly, she began to see the world differently. The sharp line that had always separated the physical from the unseen was starting to blur, and in that space between, she sensed possibilities, answers, that she couldn't yet name. Still, the path forward was far from smooth. The administration's eyes seemed to follow her now. Rumors whispered in the break room felt louder each week. The pressure to explain herself, to abandon the strange instincts she relied on, grew heavier with each shift. And in the privacy of her own thoughts, she found herself questioning, was she making these decisions through skill, or was something else moving her hands? But Rachel was learning that real strength didn't mean the absence of fear. It meant moving forward despite it. The certainty she held onto, whether it came from her own intuition or something far beyond it, had become her anchor in the storm. As the nights stretched longer and the days blurred together, her resolve hardened. These weren't just obstacles, they were a journey of self-discovery, a slow peeling back of every layer she had built around herself. Each step forward was a victory, proof she could adapt, grow, and find meaning even in the heart of chaos. And so, she pressed on. Her heart beat with the same restless mix of fear and determination that had carried her through her first night in the ER. She didn't know what was coming, only that it would test her in ways she couldn't imagine. But deep in her bones, she knew, whatever the price of truth was, she was willing to pay it. Standing at the edge of something she couldn't define, Rachel began to realize that these trials were not just about enduring hardship, they were about transformation. Each message, each impossible success, pushed her to confront not only the demands of the hospital, but also the growing chasm between the logical discipline of her training and the inexplicable nature of the guidance she was receiving. Every step forward became a delicate negotiation between the fear that she was losing her grip on reality and the dangerous comfort she was beginning to find in trusting the unseen. Her professional identity, once solid, sharp-edged, had begun to feel fragile. The hospital she had entered with such clarity and purpose now seemed like a maze of contradictions. The skepticism in her colleagues' eyes, though rarely voiced aloud, built invisible walls around her. The more she acted on the cryptic messages, the more her decisions stood outside the neat boundaries of medical protocol. And in an unsettling twist, the very miracles she performed seemed to erode her credibility rather than strengthen it. Over time, the messages shifted. They were no longer simple directives. Administer this, check that. Now they came laced with strange phrases, fragments of something larger, words that seemed to belong to a different language of medicine, one that spoke not just of organs and systems, but of energy, resonance, and invisible connections that could influence the body as profoundly as a scalpel or a drug. The concepts whispered at a truth that rattled the foundations of everything she thought she knew about healing. This evolution brought with it a heavier weight. Each message was no longer just an instruction. It was a responsibility, an unspoken contract that demanded she act without hesitation and accept the consequences without question. And those consequences were beginning to gnaw at her, because each time she followed a message, the same question rose in her mind. Was she simply saving a life, or was she interfering with the course of it? The line between healer and manipulator was thinning. Somewhere deep inside, Rachel knew that once that line disappeared entirely, she might not be able to find her way back. The more Rachel absorbed from the whispers, old records, and offhand comments from long-time staff, the more the image of Dr. Peter Van Sant began to take shape in her mind, not as the tragic headline she had once overheard, but as a man far more complex. His story, once treated as a cautionary tale about pride and professional ruin, began to feel like something else entirely. The fragments she gathered painted him as a doctor who wasn't chasing prestige but truth, driven not by ambition alone, but by an unshakable need to understand the fragile, uncharted space between life and death. His unconventional experiments, dismissed in their time as pseudoscience, now read like glimpses into a future medicine had yet to reach. That duality, a man who was both flawed and brilliant, gnawed at her. It had forced Rachel to face her own assumptions about genius, failure, and redemption. And as she reflected on him, she began to see herself in sharper focus. Her early hesitation to act on the strange messages hadn't been just fear of the unknown. It had been fear of herself, fear of what she might be capable of if she let go of the safety rails of convention. The more she succeeded, the more that fear shifted into something far more dangerous, the intoxicating realization that she could change the outcome of a life with a single choice. The hospital itself seemed to embody that same tension, its hallways steeped in the weight of triumphs and heartbreaks, its walls holding the ambitions of generations past and the limitations they couldn't escape. To Rachel, the place no longer felt like just a building dedicated to medicine. It was a living archive of unspoken truths, where the line between healing and hubris had been drawn and redrawn countless times. Her patients no longer felt like cases, charts, or diagnoses. Each one seemed to carry a distinct presence, an energy she could almost feel. The messages, once a list of inexplicable orders, had begun to reframe the way she saw them. They weren't random instructions. They were keys to unlocking something singular in each person, a chance to tilt the scales in ways she couldn't fully explain. It was no longer about treating symptoms. It was about seeing the life beneath them, and sometimes altering its trajectory. Still, the isolation pressed in. Rumors persisted, but in the shadows of those suspicions, Rachel began to find a thin thread of solidarity, a quiet network of nurses, techs, and orderlies who didn't question her instincts, who stood beside her in tense moments without needing to be told why. Trust, she realized, was no small thing in a place built on protocol and hierarchy. And the act of trusting them back, despite the risk it carried, was becoming one of her greatest acts of defiance and one of her greatest sources of strength. In the end, Rachel began to understand that the trials she had faced were never just about surviving the chaos. They were about shaping it, bending it into something with meaning. Her journey demanded that she stop clinging to the certainty she once thought was her strength, and instead embrace the uncertainty. She began to accept the paradoxes, finding unexpected power in the very places she had once seen as weaknesses. The road ahead was still riddled with shadows and sharp turns, but in the quiet corners of her struggle, she realized these trials weren't simply tests of endurance, they were revelations of what she was truly capable of. Layer by layer, a tapestry had been woven, threads of uncertainty, strands of transformation, knots of doubt, and flashes of wonder. The boundaries she once thought immovable, the lines between life, death, and the unseen, had blurred into a shifting mosaic. The messages, still arriving at strange intervals, no longer felt like random intrusions. They had become part of the fabric of her days, an invisible thread guiding her through a labyrinth she didn't fully understand. The hospital, once a temple of order and method, had transformed into a collision point between the rational and the inexplicable. Every corridor held both the echo of past healings and the weight of unsolved mysteries, and within its walls, Rachel carried the twin burdens of her gift and the suspicion it attracted. She was beginning to see that this guidance wasn't merely testing her faith, it was holding up a mirror to her own potential, reflecting a version of herself she hadn't dared to imagine. Still, questions clung to her like shadows: the fragility of reality, the price of responsibility, the elusive search for redemption. Her journey had been one long unraveling, each step stripping away the familiar and revealing a terrain that was vast, uncertain, and filled with dangerous possibilities. And so the story paused, not to close but to breathe, to let the weight of the journey settle over her and those who had been watching. For the audience, the reflection was unavoidable. Belief requires courage, and courage demands that we walk forward even when the ground beneath us feels like it might give way. Outside, the city of New York pulsed on, indifferent yet ever-present, a living witness to Rachel's extraordinary path. By the time the final shadows of this chapter began to fade, she had learned that the walls between the seen and the unseen were not barriers at all, but doorways. Her life had become a delicate dance between reason and faith, between saving lives and carrying the crushing weight of the unknown. And in the end, it wasn't the answers that had changed her, it was the questions. Rachel's journey had been one of surrender and discovery, a slow shedding of the certainties she had once held as unshakable, the strange guidance she'd received, whether from Dr. Van Saint's lingering spirit or some force she couldn't name, had become more than a series of cryptic instructions. It was a metaphor for the unseen currents that shape our lives, for the invisible bridges between reason and faith. She had learned that true healing of the body and the soul often meant stepping into the dark without proof, trusting what you could not measure. As she stood on the edge of this new understanding, Rachel realized that the line between life and death was not a wall, but a bridge, a narrow crossing where the tangible world of medicine touched the unseen realm of the human spirit. Healing could be found there, in the quiet moments when logic faltered and compassion took over, where patient and healer met in a place beyond words. The hospital, once a place of noise and secrets, had become a sanctuary of sorts. Its walls no longer felt like boundaries but like testing grounds, places where the limits of reality were challenged daily. Here, she had found her calling, to move between worlds, to listen for the whispers others ignored, and to draw strength from the very fragility of life. In recent days, the messages had gone silent. Her shifts passed without the familiar vibration in her pocket. She told herself she was grateful, that perhaps she had been released, but the quiet was strange, almost too deep. Then, on a grey morning, she boarded the subway, the hum of the city pressing in around her. As the train slipped into the dead zone between Lexington Avenue 59th Street and 5th Avenue 59th Street, her phone buzzed in her hand. One message, just 4 words: "Do not go to your shift tonight." Her breath caught. It was the first time the instructions had been about her. The train's lights flickered, plunging the car into shadow for a heartbeat before snapping back on. She stared at the screen, pulse hammering, the roar of the tunnel swallowing every other sound. For the first time, she didn't know if she wanted to obey. The road ahead would not be easy, and the questions would linger like a shadow. But Rachel knew one thing: her story was far from over. The trials of faith and resilience had only just begun, and now the price of truth would not be paid in someone else's blood. It might demand her own. And now, I want to hear from you. If you were in Rachel's place, would you skip your shift or walk straight into the unknown? Do you believe the messages are a gift or a trap? Tell us in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe and share it with someone who loves a story filled with mystery, danger, and courage. Your support helps us bring more tales like this to life.